About a century ago, Canada shattered the oppressive idea that being homosexual was a mental illness. This breakthrough gave us the freedom to step out of the shadows, be visible, raise our voices, and proudly advocate for our rights.
This marked a vital chapter in the ongoing story of embracing diverse sexual orientations and gender identities.
I think the best way to contextualize it for students would be to give them a sense of how much has changed in the last 50 years. And specifically check in with the students, regardless of their grade level, what their feelings were or experiences were with that understanding of mental health now. I think as an education system, that teachers and principals and administrators are far more transparent and available for support. And I think that we've done a lot of work within the education sector to overcome some stigma around mental health and mental illness. I think students are far more willing to seek support or to ask questions or to identify any of their own mental health needs. The best advice I'd give to teachers, in much the same way as sort of setting the context for students, would be to solicit questions from students about what they know about the DSM. What those letters mean? What's the diagnostic statistics? Well, I might look back historically and talk about not just the pathologization, but the social and cultural elements that go along with that in terms of illness and sickness and disease associated with sexual diversity and gender diversity. And I think students are growing up in an era where we've had some success as a queer community in terms of our activism, our social change, our policy, our legislation, our human rights wins in courts. That change didn't come through benevolence, it came through direct action and activism, not just by the queer community, but by so many folks who are affected by that pathologization of what were real needs.
So in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association finally, after years of pretty aggressive and activist disruptions of its meetings, decided to finally say that homosexuality was no longer a mental disorder. That was based on the gay liberation fronts, which were formed following the Stonewall riots in 1969 in New York City, that had a much more liberationist character than many of the gay organizations do now, that named themselves after the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, which was opposed to the US military and US imperialism, and were also in alliance with the Black Panther Party. So even though it was the American Psychiatric Association changing its position, it obviously had a major impact in Canada.
Regardless of how you identify, it's really important that the medical community not see you as having some kind of mental disorder. There's really not a lot you can do organizationally when the institutions that you're trying to change don't see you as sane, don't see you as having the same, as being as together and competent as other activists. So that was a really important hurdle to cross. If you are being labeled as having a mental illness, you certainly aren't confident. You don't feel confident enough to be visible, to come out to your friends and family, and certainly not be visible to your community. Gay and lesbian people, and certainly trans people as well, would be subjected to horrible treatments such as electroshock therapy, solitary confinement, or even worse, what we would today call torture. This was an important, arguably a critical barrier to cross, to be considered full humans and to have our humanity recognized and respected.
One of the major ways in which we were being policed and regulated was through this notion that supposedly we were mentally ill. So to actually defeat that in some fundamental ways was really crucial. In terms of the Canadian context, it had slightly different impact. We should remember that the 1969 Criminal Code reform that took place a couple of years before this was based on homosexuals engaging in activity in private being mentally ill. That was what Turner, what Trudeau, what the majority of people supporting the reform put forward.
And grew up at a time in the early 80s where I was seeing the queer community being associated with HIV and very much that model of disease. Watching that change happen, being involved with, being invested in it after I came out and being committed to activism to change the world, because I had internalized so much of that damage. I realized that the rights that we have been able to successfully demand, legislate, lobby, and push for in the last 50 years are precarious. And unless we're teaching new generations about the significance and the struggle and how vital it is to keep that struggle and to keep the history, we could lose those rights just as easily.
Well, I think the most important thing that we need to learn from it is that sometimes things like ZAPs, this is what it was called when people would go into the American Psychiatric Association and actually disrupt them, are actually the way to get victories won. But I think we also need to recognize that there's still major problems. We are quite familiar with many psychological and psychiatric officials and professionals still engaging in actions against queer people and against trans people in particular. And of course, right now, a major focus is against trans young people and against gender affirming care and the types of health supports within this rhetoric of parental control over young queer and trans people. There's a resurgence of this type of notion that somehow there's something fundamentally wrong.
It is not only an acknowledgement that we are not something defined in a book, a label that's put upon us. We are human, we are part of the society, we're part of everyone, and we're not being put as a mental illness. We are just who we are, and we have to celebrate that. And passing this down to the next generation, we will be able to be equipped to know that these things are not granted. We have fought for it, and we will continue to do that. Notre lutte collective pour la visibilité a changé le cours de l'histoire.